There's a particular kind of silence you don't hear much anymore. Not the silence of an empty room or a dead phone battery, but the deeper silence of a place that simply never got loud in the first place. No notification sounds. No construction crews tearing down the old to make room for the newer, shinier version. Just the creak of a wooden storefront, the smell of river water, and the sense that whatever was happening here 50 years ago is still happening, more or less, right now. Most of America sprinted into the 21st century without looking back. Strip malls replaced main streets. Chain restaurants replaced family diners. And somewhere in all that forward momentum, a certain texture of American life got quietly paved over. But not everywhere. There are towns, real, living, breathing communities, scattered across this country where that sprint never happened. Where people looked at what they had, and decided it was already enough. This isn't a story about places that got left behind. It's about places that, in many ways, chose to stay. Let's start in the middle of the country, in a part of Illinois most people drive through without stopping. Havana sits along the Illinois River, about an hour outside Springfield, and if you roll into town on a weekday afternoon, you might genuinely wonder for a moment what decade you've landed in. The neon signs on the downtown storefronts aren't vintage replicas, they're the originals, still lit, still buzzing the way they did when they were first installed. There's a movie theater that looks like it belongs in a 1962 photograph, because architecturally, it more or less does. What's remarkable about Havana isn't just the aesthetics, it's the stability underneath them. This is an affordable town in the truest sense of the word. The kind of affordable that actually changes the way people live, because when housing isn't consuming most of your income, you have room to breathe. Room to stay. And staying, generation after generation, is exactly what creates a place like this. The crime rates are low, the pace is slow, and there's no nightlife to speak of, which, depending on what you're looking for in a life, is either the catch or the whole point. A few states north, in Wisconsin, the town of Mineral Point tells a slightly different version of the same story, except here, the decision to stay rooted was almost a conscious act of community will. In the 1800s, Cornish miners came to this part of Wisconsin and built their homes out of the local limestone, the same way they would have back in Cornwall, England. Narrow streets, stone facades, a certain old-world density to the whole place. And when the 20th century started pushing toward modernization, Mineral Point did something quietly radical. It said no thank you. No mall development. No chain restaurant corridors on the edge of town. Instead, the community leaned into what it already had, the historic architecture, the artisan culture, the small-scale independent economy. Today the downtown is filled with working studios and galleries and shops run by people who actually live there. The unemployment rate hovers under 3%, which in a town that rejected the conventional economic playbook is kind of extraordinary. Mineral Point figured out that authenticity, maintained carefully over time, is its own kind of economic engine. If you head east toward Lake Michigan, you'll find Saugatuck, a town of fewer than 900 full-time residents that somehow carries the atmosphere of a place much larger than itself. It's an art town and a beach town simultaneously, which is a combination that tends to attract a certain kind of quietly creative person. But the thing that really stops visitors in their tracks isn't the galleries or the shoreline. It's the ferry. The Saugatuck chain ferry has been crossing the Kalamazoo River since the 1800s. It has no engine. It's operated entirely by hand, cranked across the water on a cable by a single ferryman. In an era where everything has been automated, optimized, and electrified, this hand-powered crossing feels almost like a philosophical statement. There's a reason people come from all over to ride it. Not because it's the fastest way across, but because it's the most human. Further west, in the flat heart of Kansas, sits a town that has structured much of its civic identity around a single man, though it would be more accurate to say it structured itself around an era, and the man simply happened to come from it. Abilene is the hometown of Dwight D. Eisenhower, and it carries that mid-century heritage with genuine pride rather than forced nostalgia. The traditional diners are real diners, not theme restaurants. The storefronts have the proportions and materials of an earlier America. And the cost of living sits just enough below the national average to make it genuinely accessible to people who want a different kind of life than the one most metropolitan areas are selling. There's something interesting about a town that takes its identity from the 1950s and early 1960s. That was the last period in American life when the pace of daily existence and the pace of technological change were still somewhat in sync with each other. Before things accelerated past the point where most people could comfortably keep up. Abilene feels like it found its footing in that moment, planted itself there, and just didn't move. Now, if Abilene represents a certain quiet Midwestern staying power, then Bisbee, Arizona represents something wilder and more improbable. This former copper mining town near the Mexican border should, by all conventional logic, be a ghost town. The mines closed. The industry left. And for a while in the 1970s, it looked like Bisbee might just quietly expire. But then something unexpected happened. Artists arrived. Then retirees. Then people who didn't quite fit anywhere else and found in Bisbee's steep, colorful hillsides a kind of permission to be exactly who they were. The town has staircases instead of sidewalks in many places, because the terrain simply doesn't allow for conventional streets. The buildings climb the mountainside in shades that shouldn't work together but somehow do. Psychedelic murals cover walls that once housed mining-era businesses. It's eccentric in a way that feels completely earned rather than manufactured, because the eccentricity grew organically out of the specific group of people who showed up when everyone else was leaving. Bisbee's economic survival today runs on tourism and the energy of those independently minded local businesses. The median home price sits at a level that still makes it accessible to creative types and people looking to genuinely start over somewhere strange and beautiful. And it works, in its own sideways manner, precisely because it never tried to become something conventional. High above all of these places, literally, sits Silverton, Colorado. 9,000 feet above sea level in the San Juan Mountains, accessible by a single road that becomes impassable in serious winter weather. There is one way in and one way out, and that geographic reality has shaped everything about how Silverton exists. The main street looks less like a functioning town and more like the set of a Western film. Saloons built during the 1800s mining boom still standing in their original form, wood-fronted and weathered, against a backdrop of mountain peaks that make you feel appropriately small. What keeps Silverton alive in the modern era is partly the tourism, and particularly the historic steam-powered train that makes seasonal runs from Durango up through the mountain passes. That train isn't just a tourist attraction, it's a living piece of the American West, still operating on the same mountain route it's been working for over a century. When that whistle sounds and the smoke rises through the thin mountain air, you're not experiencing a recreation. You're experiencing something continuous with the past, still moving forward under its own steam. And then there's Mackinac Island. There are places that resist change, and then there are places that made a formal decision about it and have been holding to that decision ever since. Mackinac Island, sitting in Lake Huron between Michigan's upper and lower peninsulas, banned automobiles in 1898. The reasoning at the time was practical. Early motor vehicles were frightening the horses. But what started as a local ordinance became, over the following century and a quarter, the defining character of an entire community. Today, roughly 600 people live year-round on Mackinac Island. They get around by bicycle, on foot, or by horse-drawn carriage. When you step off the ferry, because a ferry is the only way in, you're not just leaving your car behind. You're leaving behind the entire auditory landscape of modern life. No engines. No traffic. The sounds that reach you instead are hooves on pavement, the creak of carriage wheels, the wind off the lake. It recalibrates something in the nervous system almost immediately. The island is not inexpensive. Finite land combined with serious tourist demand means property values well above most of the towns we've talked about. But for the 600 people who call it home year-round, there's clearly something worth staying for that can't be reduced to real estate math. We should talk about Green Bank, West Virginia, because it represents something genuinely different from everything else on this list. The federal government established the National Radio Quiet Zone here to protect one of the world's largest steerable radio telescopes, a structure so sensitive that it can detect signals from billions of light years away. To protect that sensitivity, a wide swath of surrounding land is effectively a technology-free buffer. Cell towers are banned. Wi-Fi is heavily restricted. The residents of Green Bank still use landlines. About 30 people live in Green Bank proper, making it one of the smallest communities you could technically call a town. And while the digital silence there was originally imposed by scientific necessity rather than personal preference, something interesting has happened over time. People have started seeking it out. People who feel overloaded by the noise of constant connectivity, who want to live somewhere that the default setting is quiet rather than loud, have found their way to Green Bank. The median home price is genuinely low, and what you get in exchange is something that's increasingly difficult to find anywhere in the developed world, a life that is not being continuously interrupted. Out in the Chesapeake Bay, several miles from the nearest mainland shore, Tangier Island occupies a kind of floating isolation that sets it apart even in this company. There is no bridge to Tangier Island. You arrive by boat, which means you leave by boat, which gives the island a natural insulation from the pace of the outside world. About 400 people live here, many of them descendants of English settlers who arrived in the 1600s, and something remarkable has happened with the language as a result of that long isolation. The Tangier Island dialect retains sounds and speech patterns that trace back to colonial-era English. Linguists have traveled from around the world to study it. The economy runs on fishing and crabbing, the same as it has for generations. But Tangier Island carries a kind of weight that the other places on this list don't share, because it faces a threat that no amount of community will or careful preservation can hold back. Coastal erosion combined with rising water levels means that significant portions of the island may be underwater within a few decades. This is a community that has survived centuries of isolation and self-reliance, and it may ultimately be lost not to development or neglect, but to the water that surrounds it. There is something heartbreaking about that particular kind of ending, the slow encroachment of something no one can vote against. Which brings us, finally, to Nebraska. To a place that sits at the far end of the spectrum from everywhere else we've visited, because it has one resident. Monowai, Nebraska has a population of exactly one person. Her name is Elsie Eiler, and after her husband Rudy passed away in 2004, she became the sole remaining citizen of a town that has been shrinking since its mid-20th century peak. To keep Monowai legally incorporated, to keep it on the map, technically speaking, Elsie occupies every official municipal role simultaneously. She is the mayor. She is also the city council. She is the town clerk. She signs her own paperwork twice, once in each role. She runs the Monowai Tavern, which has been operating for decades and still serves the farmers and travelers who come through the area. There's something that might initially read as sad about Monowai, and it would be dishonest to say there's no melancholy there. But spend a moment with what Elsie is actually doing, and something else comes into focus. She is refusing, through sheer act of will, to let this town disappear. Every piece of paperwork she signs twice, every night she opens the tavern, is an act of stubborn loyalty to a place and a way of life that the wider world has largely moved on from. She's not in denial about what's happened to Monowai. She's simply decided that it matters anyway. That, maybe, is the thread that connects all of these places. The steam train still crossing the Colorado mountains. The hand-cranked ferry on the Kalamazoo River. The radio telescope town where the default state is silence. The limestone streets of a Wisconsin mining community that said no to the mall. The woman who signs her own paperwork twice because she refuses to be the last chapter. None of these places are perfect. None of them are selling a fantasy. They have trade-offs and limitations and the particular difficulties that come with choosing depth over velocity. But in each one, you can still feel something that's genuinely hard to name, a continuity, maybe, between the people who are there now and the people who were there before them. A sense that some things were worth keeping. And in a country that has spent the last several decades moving very fast in a fairly straight line, that feeling turns out to be worth traveling some distance to find.